Well, there's no doubt that the biggest story of the year for people living on Florida's west coast and the center part of the state was the impact of back-to-back hurricanes Helene and Milton. First came Helene in late September. 13 days later, Milton struck. Helene's impact was felt by businesses and residences in low-lying areas. Neighborhoods like Tampa's Davis Islands found themselves inundated with water. Floridians up and down the coast found their homes flooded, many for the first time. On October 9th, a few days later, Hurricane Milton came ashore in Manatee County, bringing high winds that brought down trees and power lines across Tampa Bay. Power crews from around the country descended on the state to restore power. Beach communities all along the west coast were buried in sand and continue to recover from the 1-2 punch of the storms. Rosemary, what do you think the biggest takeaways are, and what should Tallahassee be doing now that we've seen the devastation of these storms?
Well, Hurricane Helene really threw a sucker punch at Tampa Bay. I mean, even those of us who believe in science didn't believe that a storm that was 100 miles out in the Gulf could send a wall of water 4, 5, 6 feet high into people's homes. People who've lived on the coast or along rivers for decades had never seen anything like it, and so didn't think it could happen. But now that they have, I can't tell you the number of people I know personally who have moved, are planning to move, planning to rehab and wait it out a little bit and then move. These storms were a real wake-up call to the cost of living in coastal Florida or along water anywhere in Florida. And I think it's hard to, I don't know what Tallahassee will or won't do. They've not been real prone to wanting to regulate growth. They've done away with the state's growth management law. But I can tell you that the FEMA rule, that 50% rule, is having a lot of impact on people's decisions on where to live, on businesses, and it's going to affect our economy.
And this is the rule that says that if more than 50% of your house was destroyed, you've got to build up.
That's right.
Yeah. You can't build on the same pad that you were on.
And the reason they do that is that they don't want to see homes continue to be demolished, rebuilt, demolished, rebuilt. They want to fix it up. And cities and counties want to comply with that FEMA rule, because if you don't, because 90% of flood insurance comes from FEMA, so they set the rules. And if you fail to follow their rules, then you don't get flood insurance for your community at the discounted rate.
Steve, do you think in Tallahassee there's a feeling that this is the new normal and that because of things like climate change, we're going to see more of these kind of storms more frequently?
Yes, I do. Rob, the new president of the Florida Senate is a guy named Ben Albritton. He's from a rural part of the state, Wauchula, down near Lake Okeechobee. Ben Albritton is promising something he refers to as a rural renaissance for the next 2 years. He's the first real small town Senate president we've had in Florida in a very long time. Well, if he wants a rural renaissance, he ought to start with a place like Perry, Florida. It's about 50 miles southeast of Tallahassee. It was devastated by these storms. And they had the double whammy of losing a Georgia Pacific plant that decimated the town's tax base and so forth. The city of Perry is a laboratory for what can happen to a town when it's devastated by a hurricane. It's going to need a lot of help from Tallahassee in the next couple of years. These cities that we see bearing the brunt of this damage from a storm, Steinhatchee, Cedar Key, places like that, ought to be at the forefront of the legislative agenda next session.
You know, I'm wondering about insurance too, because I had several state legislators on the program last week. They all said that the insurance reforms that were passed during the past few sessions ought to be given a chance to see if they work. And nobody in Tallahassee is suggesting.
They keep talking about reform all the time, and nothing ever gets reformed.
Let me give you the statistic, Dan. According to data from the Florida Office of Insurance Regulation, the OIR, the two hurricanes resulted in 436,000 claims. 27% were closed without payment. That means that more than 100,000 claims were denied.
You know, for decades in this country, as you look, it's not just Florida and the hurricanes, it's the Midwest with tornadoes, it's the West with wildfires. wildfires and so forth and so on. For decades, we've talked about having a national cat fund to help pay for some of this stuff, because the entire country is, I mean, what happens in Florida, there's a domino effect elsewhere across the country. And so I think we need a more national perspective on creating a cat fund that would ease the burden of homeowners across the country who have to deal with these natural disasters.
And lower rates for us here in
Right.
Florida, yeah, if it was spread out. Tara, what do you think?
Well, you know, I think that although that's true that we need to have a national dialogue about it, locally it's really interesting. I mean, I'm from St. Pete. Of course, we have to give a shout out to our Indian mounds. It could have been a lot worse if we didn't honor them. And we also saw some of the best of the Bay. We saw our neighbors and our communities show up for each other. But I think there's going to be some local implications. We learned that we're really good at communicating for hurricane preparedness, evacuation, did a great job with that, but post-hurricane, municipalities were inconsistent, the debris removal was inconsistent.
It was very slow.
Very slow, and I think those are going to have big consequences, that impact on the next elections for those that were in office.
Mm-hmm. Rosemary, do you think that there should be an attempt to move people back from the coastline? Because we know that if global warming continues, sea levels are rising, and these homes that are right along the coast are going to be more and more in danger.
Right. In Pinellas County, there were 34,000 homes damaged. 23 were substantially damaged. That means, 23,000 are uninhabitable. That's a huge number. And yet 80% of the economy of Florida is on the coast. People want to be by the water, so it drives the revenues for our cities and counties and our state. And so getting people to move back is probably unrealistic, but getting them to move up to elevate is more realistic. But government help, FEMA help to either relocate or to raise homes is tapped out. There's just not the money, and most people cannot afford to spend $200,000 to raise a 3-2 house.
Yeah.